What if the Queen's final words weren't spoken but sealed away, waiting for the right moment to explode everything we thought we knew? What if Princess Anne, the most loyal and least dramatic of them all, had been holding on to a secret that could alter the very fabric of the monarchy? This wasn't some sentimental farewell tucked into the folds of grief. No, it was a royal warning, a declaration, a hidden message that didn't just bless the future, it redirected it. And at the center of it all were two names the world knows by heart: William and Catherine. But not in the way you expect. Because what Anne revealed next wasn't tradition. It was transformation. And when those words were finally spoken aloud, the crown itself began to shift. The truth had been locked away for months. Until now, Princess Anne had requested everyone's presence after yet another grim update about the king's health. Her reputation had never been tied to dramatics or declarations. That's what made it worse. She didn't speak often, but when she did, the room listened. And this time, she wasn't holding a speech. She was holding a letter. Not just any letter. It was sealed in the Queen's private crest, never seen before, and handed to Anne in the final days of Queen Elizabeth's life. Even King Charles had been unaware of its existence. And now, with the king's health deteriorating and questions about the monarchy's direction spinning out of control, Anne decided it was time. She broke the seal and began to read. The room fell quiet as her voice cut through the silence. The words were personal but precise. Elizabeth hadn't written to comfort or reminisce. She wrote to correct course. When the storm begins to brew, she had written, "Read this." The storm had come. The Queen knew it would. What followed wasn't praise or poetry. It was a royal verdict cloaked in calm language. She spoke directly of William and Catherine, not as heirs, but as the core of the monarchy's survival. And then the line that shifted the air in the room. Let her lead not behind, but beside. The throne was never built for one. That sentence didn't feel like blessing. It felt like blueprint. Anne's voice trembled not from nerves, but from weight. Catherine's eyes didn't move. William blinked slowly, processing what none of his royal training had prepared him for. The Queen's final words weren't nostalgia. They were instruction, and what came next would turn duty into destiny. But as Anne began to read the Queen's final words aloud, it became clear this was not a goodbye. It was a command, wrapped in love. She wasn't born into royalty, but the Queen saw something in Catherine that even William hadn't fully understood. Until now. It wasn't just elegance, it wasn't just composure. It was something far more dangerous. Quiet power. The kind of power that doesn't demand a throne, but earns it. And as Anne's voice continued reading from the letter, the shift in tone was undeniable. Queen Elizabeth didn't call Catherine her daughter-in-law. She didn't even call her Duchess. She called her the soul of the new monarchy, the one who, in silence, had held together a family on the verge of fracturing, the one who didn't carry the bloodline, but carried something even greater: public trust, private steadiness, a heart that could withstand a crumbling institution and still choose grace. The Queen's words weren't sentimental. They were calculated. She wrote that Catherine embodied everything the crown would need to survive: restraint in a world addicted to drama, dignity in an era starving for leadership, and devotion that wasn't performative, but lived. Elizabeth had seen monarchies fall in Europe, scandals rip through Buckingham Palace, and heirs falter under the pressure of legacy. But in Catherine, she saw something different. Not a performer, not a symbol. A woman who made royalty human again. She called her the bridge between past and future. Not between titles, not between families, but between what the monarchy had been and what it had to become. For William, those words didn't land gently. They cut and soothed at the same time. He looked at Catherine not with the eyes of a husband, but with the eyes of a future king reading his own instructions. He had always seen her as his partner, but in this moment, he realized she wasn't just standing beside him. She was holding something far heavier: a public that adored her, a queen who anointed her in private, and a future that now depended on her ability to carry both tradition and reform, without losing herself in either. His pride was undeniable. but so was his grief. Because deep down, William had always been the one preparing, training, waiting. Yet now, he was watching his wife become the unspoken heir in a game that had never allowed two winners. The Queen hadn't chosen Catherine instead of William. She had chosen Catherine because of William, because she believed that only together could they steer the monarchy out of the fire. But even as Anne folded the letter and the room sat in stunned silence, one line continued to echo louder than the rest. The throne was never built for one. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a foreshadowing. Because the Queen's words didn't just uplift Catherine, they hinted at a hidden sacrifice William would soon have to face. He had trained all his life to be king, yet in the Queen's final vision, William's role was never about power. It was about heart. From childhood, he had carried the weight of the crown in waiting. Every move studied, every word measured. He wasn't just groomed to lead, he was expected to restore. But Queen Elizabeth saw something deeper, something William himself had never confronted. Her letter didn't glorify his preparation. It questioned the path entirely. She praised his discipline, his restraint, his loyalty to duty, but then she shifted. In a single sentence, she flipped the crown on its head. Your power lies in supporting, not in leading alone. It wasn't a dismissal, it was a calling. And it shattered every expectation ever built around him. This wasn't the Queen doubting him. This was the Queen trusting him with a truth few leaders ever accept. That strength isn't found in standing above, it's in choosing to stand beside. She had watched William struggle silently between the role expected of him and the life he built with Catherine. The Queen, often silent in public emotion, poured something else into that letter, wisdom sharpened by regret. She had seen how tradition demanded sacrifice. She had made it herself, and she didn't want William to do the same. Don't wear the crown alone, she wrote, or it will crush everything you love. Anne's voice softened as she read that line, and William's face betrayed a crack in his stoic armor. His jaw clenched, his eyes glistened. A man raised to endure was now being asked to feel. He wasn't losing the throne, but he was being told that legacy means nothing if love is lost in the process. Catherine wasn't just the Queen's unspoken choice. She was the compass. And William, instead of claiming dominion, was being called to walk beside her, not ahead of her. It was the most selfless order he had ever been given, and it demanded something he hadn't trained for: surrender. The tear that rolled down his cheek wasn't from defeat. It was from understanding. For the first time, he saw that the monarchy the Queen envisioned wasn't ruled by a single heir, but by a united front, a shared duty, a reign reimagined. William's quiet sacrifice wouldn't be a headline. It wouldn't be inscribed in royal history books, but it would shape everything that followed. Because his strength was no longer measured by a crown, but by the courage to share it. But what sealed this moment was not just the Queen's praise. It was Anne's next revelation, one she had kept locked in silence for months. For years, Anne carried the weight of her mother's most private truth, and now she was ready to speak it aloud. When Queen Elizabeth handed her that sealed letter, it wasn't just an act of trust. It was a burden only Anne could carry. She had served the monarchy in silence for decades, never seeking the spotlight, never asking for praise. But in that moment, the Queen looked at her not as a daughter, but as the one person who would not flinch when the storm came. The Queen's voice, quiet and steady, had said only this: "When the cracks begin to show, let them hear my voice again." Anne didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She understood. And now, with King Charles ailing and the monarchy's foundation trembling beneath the surface, Anne knew the cracks had come. She stood before her family, not as the Queen's daughter, but as her messenger. And the message wasn't flattering. It wasn't soft. It was precise. Elizabeth had chosen Catherine, not with titles or ceremonies, but with her final words. The Queen saw what Anne had once missed, what many had missed. In Catherine's silence was steel. In her calm was power. Anne admitted it openly. She hadn't always believed Catherine was strong enough for what lay ahead. She had watched her from a distance, skeptical of the soft-spoken newcomer who married into the storm. But time had peeled away the facade. What Catherine endured, the pressure, the expectations, the whispers behind palace walls, would have broken many. But she didn't break. She rose, quietly, gracefully, steadily. Anne had seen her mother make impossible decisions in secret, and now she understood why this one had stayed hidden. The world wasn't ready to hear it. The family wasn't ready to accept it. But Anne had held the truth, and she had watched it unfold with her own eyes. Catherine had become the Queen's vision in flesh. And William, steady, loyal, grieving, was no longer just an heir. He was the other half of a new kind of monarchy, a monarchy the Queen had foreseen, a monarchy that only stood a chance if these three, Anne, William, and Catherine, stood together. The silence that followed Anne's confession wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Because those in the room knew something had just shifted. The past had passed. The future was speaking. But if the monarchy was to survive, there was still one thing: missing public trust and one final act of clarity from the royal family. The palace never planned to make this public, but with the Queen's words now shared in private, the world needed to hear the truth. For decades, the monarchy's greatest strength had been its silence. But now, that silence had become a liability. The Queen's final letter had changed everything inside the royal walls, and Anne knew that if this moment remained hidden, it would only widen the divide between tradition and the people. She stood firm, convincing King Charles and William that transparency wasn't just a gesture, it was survival. What the Queen had written was too important, too timely, too rooted in love to be buried. And reluctantly, the decision was made. The letter, or at least parts of it, would be made public. A royal statement was drafted. Not just a press release, but a declaration. For the first time in years, the Crown would speak not with titles, but with truth. When the statement was released, the world paused. Headlines didn't need drama. The words themselves were enough. Let her lead not behind, but beside. The quote exploded across television screens and social feeds. Queen Elizabeth's final vision, once locked away in a private letter, had become a national reckoning. People didn't just read it, they felt it. And the reaction wasn't confusion or outrage. It was clarity. Catherine wasn't just the Duchess anymore. She was, in the hearts of millions, the people's future queen. It wasn't just the line about leadership that struck a chord. It was the humanity behind it. The Queen had acknowledged change, had chosen love over lineage, partnership over protocol, and that choice hit deeper than any coronation. In a rare joint appearance, William and Catherine stepped forward, not as monarchs in waiting, but as two individuals ready to honor a vision larger than either of them. William didn't speak first. Catherine did. Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of a legacy she never asked for. She thanked the Queen, she promised to serve, and she reminded the world that strength often hides in silence. When William did speak, his voice cracked as he called. The Queen's letter, not a burden, but a blessing. And for the first time, the world saw not just a future king, but a husband choosing faith in his partner. The monarchy had been shaken, but not shattered. In fact, something rare was happening. Renewal. The Queen's truth had sparked not a rebellion, but a revival. The public, for the first time in years, saw themselves in the story again. A woman rising, a man stepping aside with pride, a family standing together without pretense. It wasn't just about blood anymore, it was about belief. And with the people's blessing, a new form of monarchy began to rise, one written in love, shaped by resilience, and spoken in a language the world could finally understand. But even as the world applauded the Queen's vision, one question echoed through the palace halls: can Catherine carry this alone? Beneath her calm presence, Catherine was still healing from cancer, from grief, and now from the weight of the crown. The world saw her poised, polished, smiling. But behind palace doors, the silence was heavier than ever. Even as the Queen's words swept across the nation and the public embraced her as the monarchy's future, Catherine remained quiet. Not out of fear, but because she knew the road ahead wasn't paved in admiration. It was paved in expectation. Every glance, Every step, every breath was now under the microscope. And the woman who had once slipped into royal life unnoticed was now the center of it all. Her crown wasn't yet on her head, but it was already on her shoulders. Despite the fatigue and the quiet pain of her health recovery, Catherine pressed on. She kept her schedule. She met the public. She smiled for the cameras. But when the doors closed, her hands sometimes shook. And it was during one of those quiet moments that Anne appeared. No ceremony, no press, just Anne, who had once doubted, her now offering something rare comfort. She didn't speak like a princess. She spoke like a woman who understood pressure without applause. She reminded Catherine of the Queen's words. She believed in you before you ever believed in yourself. That wasn't flattery. That was fact. And Catherine, moved by the sincerity, said something she had never dared to say aloud. What if I'm not enough? The words hung there, raw and real. The future queen confessing the fear no one wanted to imagine. Later that evening, she shared that same fear with William. The palace was quiet, the world still watching, but all she needed was one answer. One truth to silence the storm inside her. William looked at her, not as a royal, not as the heir, but as the man who had loved her long before any of this began. And his response wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't diplomatic. It was the only thing that mattered. You were always more than enough. That line didn't erase the burden, but it reminded her that she never carried it alone. The Queen may have written her name in history, but it was William's belief that kept her grounded in the present. Still, the path ahead wasn't just ceremonial, it was personal. Catherine's strength didn't come from crowns or titles. It came from continuing through pain, smiling through exhaustion, and showing up when disappearing would have been easier. Her strength was the kind that couldn't be taught. It had to be earned. And yet, even in the midst of that resilience, a shadow loomed. The Queen's final letter hadn't just pointed to Catherine. It hinted at something else, a plan. One that had never been shared publicly. One that, if revealed, could rewrite the rules of the monarchy all over again. But the Queen's final words weren't just about Catherine's strength. They also hinted at a plan no one saw coming. Inside the Queen's letter was one last paragraph, one no one expected. A plan so bold, it could change everything. After pages filled with sentiment, insight, and foresight, this closing line didn't offer comfort. It detonated tradition. Queen Elizabeth, ever the strategist behind the curtain, hadn't just named Catherine as the soul of the monarchy, she had redefined the monarchy itself. She wrote not of succession in singular terms, but of shared destiny. Let them reign, side by side, she said, not as ruler and consort, but as equals, as the monarchy must become if it is to survive what's coming. This wasn't symbolism. It was a shift in royal philosophy. And it wasn't meant for history books. It was meant for action. The Queen had lived long enough to witness the damage done by outdated power structures. She had watched kings isolate and queens obey. But she had also seen Catherine rise not by command, but by character. And she knew William's strength came not from standing alone, but from standing with someone who grounded him. Her final words outlined a vision of dual rule, not as a gimmick, but as the monarchy's last chance to stay human, modern, and real. It was a plan born from experience and carved from regret. The Queen had ruled alone for decades. She knew the loneliness, she knew the weight, and she didn't want her grandson or his wife to bear it separately. When King Charles read that final line, he didn't protest. He didn't question it. He simply nodded, quietly, as if he had known this was coming all along. The crown was never meant to be held with clenched fists. And Charles, weary from his own battles, finally saw the value in letting go with grace. His blessing wasn't a speech or a ceremony. It was a silent approval passed through a single glance, a generational baton handed forward not just in title, but in vision. The Queen hadn't left behind a monarchy chained to rules. She had left behind a blueprint for rebirth. A monarchy that would be led by partnership, not patriarchy. One that would place compassion above protocol, stability above superiority. And in Catherine and William, she believed that balance could finally exist. but her warning was clear. If you lead as they did before you, you will fall as they did before you. The old way was done, and the storm she predicted was already forming on the horizon. And as the royal family stood together at the edge of a new era, one final legacy was about to rise. From the Queen's final words rose a royal future shaped not by blood, but by courage, unity, and love. The shift wasn't announced with trumpets or parades. It was felt in quiet speeches, in softened protocol, and in the way William and Catherine stood before the world, not as ruler and consort, but as partners. The monarchy had been rewritten without rewriting the Constitution. And though the titles remained, the spirit behind them had changed forever. The people saw it. They felt it. For the first time in a generation, the royal family didn't seem distant. They seemed human. The burden of the crown hadn't disappeared. It had been divided, shared, balanced in the hands of two people who had learned that real power isn't in commanding silence, but in earning trust. William, long prepared to lead, now chose to lead differently. He deferred not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to understand the world no longer needed another king commanding alone. It needed balance. It needed Catherine. And in her, he had found the same wisdom his grandmother had seen years ago. Their reign would be quieter, sharper, grounded in service, not spectacle. It was the kind of monarchy Elizabeth had only dreamed of in her final days. A monarchy no longer shaped by the weight of tradition, but by the depth of connection. Duty still mattered, but it would now be delivered with empathy, not distance. By their side stood Princess Anne, not in the spotlight, but never far. The Queen had trusted her with her most sacred truth, and Anne wasn't about to let that trust go to waste. She became the quiet guardian of this new vision. She held the line. She corrected gently. And in her calm presence, William and Catherine found not only guidance, but reassurance. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a rebirth. The world had changed. The crown had to follow. And Anne made sure it did. The global response was overwhelming, not just from Britain, but from every corner of the world still watching the royal family with fascination, doubt, and hope. What they saw now wasn't a dynasty clinging to relevance. They saw renewal. From news anchors to foreign dignitaries, from childhood admirers to staunch critics, one sentiment echoed louder than any other. Maybe this could work. Not because of privilege, but because of purpose. Because behind the jewels and formality now stood something far more powerful: humanity. And then, when the noise faded and the ceremonies paused, Catherine returned to the place where all of this began. Alone, she stood before the Queen's resting place. No cameras, no audience. Just a whisper, barely audible, but etched in history. We'll carry it forward. It wasn't a promise, it was a vow. Because the Queen may be gone, but through her final words, the future was written. And it begins now. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.